Good morning, everyone, and happy Halloween. Welcome to this month's edition of Couch Coding, Performance Issues and Solutions. Your experts for today are David Strauss, co-founder here at Pantheon, and Steve Persh, agency and community engineer, also here at Pantheon. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we start. Please make sure you submit any questions you have during the session in the question window. We want to answer as many of your questions during the presentation as possible, so make sure you keep those coming. Also, the session will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to everyone later this week. I'd now like to turn it over to David and Steve.
Hi, folks.
Hello.
I'm going to kick things off with the favorite part for me of starting any performance analysis, which is actually figuring out where the problems are. And the reason why I like to start off with this is because I see a lot of over-optimization on sites, or over-optimization of the wrong things. And it ultimately comes down to looking at user behavior and how different things on performance impact that. So Steve has graciously created this spooky performance site in of this month, and has set things up on this site to not be quite ideal. It is deployed to Pantheon already. It does get to take advantage of a lot of the infrastructure we have in place, including the CDN for accelerating the delivery of the content to the browser, but there are a lot of optimization tweaks that are still yet to be made. And what I'm going to walk through initially on is the tools for doing the diagnostics of this sort of thing. So the tool that's right for you is going to depend on where you are in your performance analysis. The most basic tool that I like to start with is Google's Test My Site tool. It's just testmysite.thinkwithgoogle.com. You can also just search for something like Google Page Speed Test or Test My Site Google. And this one's a really simple utility. You just put in the URL and you click the button. Now, if your site is available over HTTP and HTTPS, you might actually get different results for the two of them because different features are available over the two protocols these days. I like to test with HTTPS because when you do things right, testing with HTTPS is often faster, and delivering a site over HTTPS is faster than over HTTP these days if you use the right technology stack. So I also, just to save a little bit of time, we'll do this cooking show style. Rather than clicking on here and waiting a minute or two, I have the results ready to go. So the start of the results is Google explaining how many seconds the page takes to load on a mobile device. Specifically, a typical 2015-2016 generation of hardware over a 3G class network. Google's choice of this is not designed to just be focusing on an earlier year. This is actually designed to be focusing on the reality of 2017. And the reason why is that most people loading websites over phones are still loading them over 3G class connections. Not that the phone says 3G on the device, but the actual speed of the connection is close to 3G class. Google estimates that the majority of people in even Europe and North America will be loading over 3G class connections through about 2020. At that point, we're going to start seeing things averaging closer to the bottom of the 4G range. But regardless, a lot of the overhead is actually the round trips to the server and other things that will not substantially reduce with those changes anyway. What Google does is they don't just measure the time loading this on a mobile device, they also measure the estimated visitor loss. And they do that based on some really well-known statistics on visitor loss. There was a great study done with HubSpot and conversion rates. And what they found is by aggregating about 12 different studies, they found that there was an incredible impact on page load times to conversion rates. And a conversion rate, for people who aren't versed on the sort of marketing and sales ease of this, is the idea that when someone comes to the site, they actually do what you want on the site. This means whether it's signing up to volunteer, whether it's buying a product, whether it's posting a comment, whether it's reading several news stories, whatever you count as conversion, they're sort of using as a basic method of counting conversion here. Most conversions, though, are counted as doing something like a transaction. But it's pretty staggering how much performance can actually drag this down. By adding a second or two to page load time, you can actually lose about 2/3 of the conversion rate. So people can end up on the site and lose patience before they actually do what they came to the site to do. And that's really bad. So Google takes that sort of metric, takes the 6 seconds here, and translates that into what percentage of visitor loss there is at the top of the funnel. And what we mean by that is when someone comes to the site, before they even finish loading the page, they might give up on doing whatever they came to the site to do. But there are many, many things that can actually add to this time. 6 seconds is not terrible, especially on a mobile device. But the other reason why mobile devices get checked is because they're also a little more challenging. Because they have less bandwidth than desktop browsers typically do, because they're running on less powerful processors than a desktop machine, that changes the rendering time of this content. And even if they have the same speed of processor as a desktop device, they're going to be much more conservative with how much power they spend rendering pages. So this is often a really interesting metric to work with, because if this metric is great, then almost every metric will be great. If your backend performance is slow, then it'll show in this metric. If your images are huge, it'll show in this metric. If you are on infrastructure that delivers the content slowly, even if your origin is fast, it's going to show in this metric. And so if you can get this great, then you can solve almost all the things feeding this metric as well. And what I like to do following looking at that number, assuming it's not quite in the best range, is I scroll down to the bottom of here and I look at this number down here. What Google's showing down here is it's showing that this is the time that they think that you can save by making optimizations on the site itself. Now, one of the most telling things you can do is putting a site through this and seeing how big the difference is between the number at the top and the number at the bottom. Because if these two numbers have a lot of difference, then it's actually probably your hosting provider or CDN that is impacting a lot of the performance, because Google will show that you can't actually save that much time by making optimizations within Drupal or WordPress. But in this case, this is running on Pantheon with global CDN. That means that all these assets for the site are getting cached, even if they're oversized. It means that the site's getting delivered over HTTP2. It means that Google's connecting to a local point of presence for the closest server. And that means that of the top fixes for the site, mostly we're looking at things that can be done on the actual site itself. Image optimization, where the JavaScript is. Google plugs their own accelerated mobile pages, or AMP, but we're not going to be going into that. This time, we're mostly going to be focusing on non-proprietary methods. Now, if these top fixes aren't actionable enough, you can click the thing to get a report. They'll email you something. I'm pretty sure they sign you up for a mailing list, or you can hop over to webpagetest.org and run a performance test on this. When you run something like this, this is going to provide a really detailed waterfall analysis of the site. In this case, the site, this is actually doing a desktop class test just to compare apples to apples. If I go here and change this to doing something that is basically, let's say, a Nexus 7. Oh, that's a little old. That'll do the trick. Then we can run this and get a little more apples to apples. But while it's running, what I wanted to introduce were some other tools for looking at infrastructure and showing the things that are kind of getting right out of the box on Pantheon, but you might have to do manually depending on where you are. Another tool I like to use is this ping test tool from KeyCDN. So KeyCDN is not a CDN that we use at all with Pantheon, but they do have some nice tools for actually evaluating the performance of sites. So what you can do is you can plug in a domain here. this tool is fast enough to run that I'll just do it real time. And what this does is it takes all these different pops around the world, these little push pins on this map, and it pings the site from all of those. So it shows you, for a visitor accessing from each of these locations, how long does it take them to reach one of the servers for the site. Now, you might notice that these numbers are really, really uniform. I mean, compared to a lot of sites on the web. Because this is actually not just contacting one system in one place. If I put in, I'm trying to think of a good URL to put on here because we've moved basically everything on Pantheon over. So maybe we'll open it up during questions to test out some of the sites from people who are viewing the webinar and looking into some of the performance of those. But as you can see here, the times of access are very uniform across the globe, with a few small outliers for a few milliseconds. Just to give kind of context to how much of a difference this makes, going across the US alone can take about 65 to 75 milliseconds for a round trip. Going across the Atlantic can take around the same amount to a little more. Going between somewhere like Australia and New Zealand and North America or Europe can take up to 200 milliseconds. And then when you're loading the site, it's going to do more than one round trip to establish the connection. In the case of something like HTTP 1.1, an older stack, and a typical deployment without modern TLS, without HTTP 2, without a CDN, you're looking at adding up to a second or two to page load times if you don't have that sort of infrastructure. And then you can also test whether the site has HTTP 2 on here, which allows it to negotiate one connection rather quickly and use that same connection for all the resources of the site. And what that also gets into is, once we actually want to get into the nitty-gritty of the site, we start pulling up things like developer tools, something like the network tab, and we can run our own test here. Let me actually disable caching here. And this is just disabling the browser cache here so that we can see what it looks like to someone loading this. Whoops, I didn't mean to click that. Just trying to get a little bit more view here. Let's see where I can. Let's pop this out. Okay. Is the whole screen shared?
Yep, should be.
Okay.
Yeah, I can still see everything, David.
Yep. Okay, great. And as soon as I figure out how to resize this box here, or not the. Let me disable the filter. I'm on another computer here.
David, you might have to still do a hard refresh to see assets come in.
There we go. So here we have the waterfall. Let me give a little bit more room to the waterfall. So you often want to do a hard refresh. You can also click Disable Cache up here, and then that will treat it as not using the local cache of the web browser at all for the purpose of these tests. So what we can do here is we can look at this page, and we can start looking at things like how cacheable it is.
It's not cacheable at all.
Yep. We can look at things like how many resources there are on the site. If you didn't have a CDN, you might want to look at how much lead time there are on these things. So on these, you can see there's only a few milliseconds of queuing and stalling behavior on these pieces of content. And also the waiting time for the time to first byte is still pretty low. If those are much higher, that may be an infrastructure issue for you rather than an origin configuration issue. But ultimately, what we see here is about 100 CSS files. We see images, some of which are rather large, multiple megabytes. As a rule of thumb, you really want the size of your page to be a megabyte or so, especially if you're expecting mobile users to load it. So this is me on Mac. How do I get this to the full screen? I did the thing to blow it up.
That is a great question.
I clicked the thing that expands it to full screen. Maybe it's under window controls.
Go ahead. See it again.
I was just going to say, I'm not even sure what you did in the first place.
Well, I clicked that green button.
Mm-hmm.
You can also go to expose and switch back.
Go crazy.
I don't know how to do that. It doesn't have dedicated buttons
You know,
anymore.
this might be a good time to turn it over to Steve.
Yeah, David, let's toss it over and fix these problems. We've already found a bunch.
I believe this counts as a performance issue as well. Alrighty, Steve, you should now be getting presenter controls.
All right, let me know when you can see spooky performance on my machine.
It is looking very creepy on the screen now.
Spooky, spooky. I feel like we should give a shout out to the Met for open sourcing an incredible library of images here. All these came from the Met's website. They recently combed through their archives, took every bit of artwork that they think doesn't have any copyright on it, and made it freely available. So that helps supply a bunch of, well, spooky or semi-spooky images of these spheres here. All right, so I'm going to jump back over to Chrome here, where I'm not logged in, since we're more concerned about the performance right now of anonymous users rather than people who are logged in. So jumping back over to that network tab, David, it looked like there were a bunch of problems on this site right off the bat. Should we try fixing some of these things?
We should definitely try fixing some of these things.
All right, where should we start?
I think the first things are the ones that are just checkboxes in the CMS.
All right, that sounds good. I missed some checkboxes. So probably that full page cache one, right?
That's a good start.
All right. All right. So for anyone who missed it, one way we know that full page cache is off and not doing what it should be doing is just by looking directly at those HTTP headers that David was showing. So cache control sounds like an important header. Right now it says no cache, must revalidate, and this H header is telling me that this response is 0 seconds old. So I'm hoping that when I enable caching again, which will change this header, I'll start to see this H header go up because our page will have been cached for a longer period of time. All right, page caching. Here we go. How about let's just start with 10 minutes. So with that one change, still getting a no cache. All right, I think our cache control header changed. Here we go. And David, should this just always be on for the vast majority of websites? Is there any reason to not?
There's almost no reason to not leave it on. If someone's logged into the site, or there's a reason for pages to be delivered without caching, it's totally possible to deliver those pages without caching, and deliver pages to those users without caching, without skipping caching of most of the pages. The real benefit here is also in a huge pressure relief under loads of traffic, because if the first page that people land on before they log in or do anything on the site is cached, it means that it takes a lot of the strain off the CMS. If you have the basic pages cached in the browser. And it lowers the load time as well, because it means that not only are you hitting a cache for those pages, it means that that page can propagate out to all the points of presence of the CDN around the world. So it's very likely that someone can hit the page not even just in North America, but hit the page in the cache in a nearby region.
Mm-hmm.
And that reduces page load times.
Mm-hmm. So even if I have a few paths on my site that for some reason can't be cached, I should still, at the core level, have it on because there's a good chance that the home page is something that's going to be cached, and you want that cached for everybody all over the world.
Absolutely.
All right.
And as we'll go into in a few minutes, and you're of course aware of, is that if we need to be able to selectively update pages and keep things fresh, there are better ways than turning off caching, and better ways of keeping the caching time really low.
Okay. So we turned on caching, and over in curl here, I'm seeing this age header go up. One of my favorite simple helpers is grepping. Makes it a little easier to read. In this case, I don't really want to see content language, but it's nice to just pipe grep, and then I can see max age and age right there. So I should see the same thing over here, right? So I'm doing a hard refresh because as I was doing like the normal refresh, I was getting a 304 status code. David, could you tell, what does 304 mean?
Well, 304 means that your browser had a copy of the content and was able to validate with the server, or in this case the CDN, that the copy of content that it has is still the current version of the content. And this is another advantage to using the page caching, because when there's a copy in the CDN, browsers can actually revalidate their content with that. The other way to do this without doing a hard refresh is checking the disable cache up there, and you cannot get any 304s if you turn that on.
Okay. That's good to know.
And often that's really the better way to test anyway, because in many cases you don't want to be testing the second or third page load, because in many cases people going to websites will land on one page, and it's actually kind of a minority of cases where the initial page load leads to them loading additional pages. I mean, conversion rates, even if they're really high in a site, there's typically still a really high bounce rate. And so I like to test without any caching, because if you have really poor first-time page load performance, then you're going to lose a lot of people. And if you have really good first-time page load performance, then your subsequent pages will also load well too, because they'll either be as good or better.
Okay, so I've heard people say, we'll accept loading extra stuff on the first page load because it's going to make subsequent page loads faster. But what you're saying is, if the first page request is slow, you might not get any second request.
Correct.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. So I'm refreshing this page here, and I'm still getting age 0. But over in curl, I was getting age higher than 0.
You need to, yeah. So what we should check here is if there are other things that could be invalidating the ability to hit the cache. So at this point, we actually need to scroll down and look at the request headers.
Okay.
Specifically to see, yeah.
Oh, there's a cookie that says no cache equals 1. That seems important. So I put this little landmine in here because this is the kind of thing we do see as we work with developers on how best to use Pantheon. I've got this custom JavaScript file in my custom theme. I've got this file called Cookie Monster, and I'm setting a cookie called no cache. You might not for real set a cookie called no cache, but sometimes in building a site, you do have a reason to bust the cache over and over again. Like we just check this disable cache button. Sometimes in the course of development, developers put in things like, yeah, let's bust cache via JavaScript, and then simply forget to take it out. So So let me take that out. So I'm doing that here in my local. I've got a local version of the site. Oh, I should switch branches. All right, so let's just comment that out. And I've actually got an rsync going. David, how much do you use multi-dev when you're working with, or I should say on server development, like SFTP mode, when you're just hacking on a site?
I like to use it when I'm making many, many changes in a row. Like if I'm doing something like reconfiguring settings.php, or maybe I'm exporting configuration and trying things over and over again. It avoids having to do that sort of pattern of where you're committing a bunch of things to Git, and the commit message is just something like changes 20 times over.
Yeah. I've definitely had some Git histories that that read like that, especially when I'm working on continuous integration. All right, so I think I've got it working now. Let's see. Hey, H17. Look at that. All right, so I edited that JavaScript file, and David, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in our outline, but this is the only JavaScript file on this whole page. One of the things I like about Drupal 8 is that for anonymous users, by default, no JavaScript gets loaded at all. David, can you just talk a little bit about the role JavaScript commonly plays in slowing down sites?
The biggest problem that JavaScript can play is that you have scripts that need to load and need to actually execute before the page can render. It's called render blocking, yes. Google will highlight it in their survey of sites, and they will basically tell you that the JavaScript should get optimized, because what you really want is as few things to stand in the way of the content rendering as possible. JavaScript can be doubly a problem because not only is it an additional resource that can be fairly large, especially if it's a pretty big library, but also on a mobile device with a power optimized setup, rendering the page and actually running all the JavaScript can actually add even seconds to page load times, especially if it's something really heavy like a single page app. So what you really want is to have something that satisfies users' eyeballs even before the page becomes interactive, which is why tools like webpagetest.org highlight these different phases, where the first time you actually render something, where you give the user something more than a white screen. They talk about Google's Lighthouse tool and their web page test tool, or the Test My Site tool, talk about first meaningful paint, which is really when the content stops jumping around on the screen. And then you have when the content is kind of scrollable, where you don't just see something on the screen but can move up and down on it. And then there's kind of full interactivity where all the buttons work. You can click anything that you need to have functional, and that all plays. And really, it's not about actually achieving interactivity as fast as possible. It's actually better to achieve interactivity a little later if it means that you can get things on the screen faster. So what you want to do is move a lot of the JavaScript, especially things like analytics tools that don't even provide interactivity to the user typically, and have the render in a way that doesn't block the actual page. So that often means moving it to the bottom of the page. There's a whole litany of techniques around how you deliver the JavaScript. One of the other things you can do is be using JavaScript off a major public CDN, like Google's copy of jQuery. This is actually one of the things that these performance tests don't show very accurately, because when we disable cache on here, it disables everything in the browser's cache, even though this browser is really likely to have a copy of jQuery from Google.
Sure.
And the same is for mobile phones. So unfortunately, there's not really a great test that allows you to disable the cache in a way that perfectly represents someone's first landing on a site, but otherwise with the typical populated cache. So there are a whole bunch of things you can do there for JavaScript. In this case, since we don't have very much JavaScript on the site, the performance bottlenecks we're encountering here are primarily other things.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that worries me is the number of CSS files we had. We had like 100, right?
Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
and this issue is mitigated a good deal by having HTTP2, because traditionally a browser like Chrome would only request up to 6 things at once from a server. And not only could it only request 6 things at a time, it wouldn't be able to request any more things until the first things had arrived. So what it would do is it would break all of these CSS files up into batches of 6, and then it would issue each of those as multiple rounds to the server, which meant that every single group of 6 was a full round trip, and if there's no CDN, a full round trip all the way to the origin. So let's say I'm browsing a site from Europe and it's hosted in North America. Every group of 6 files would be adding another 100 or 200 milliseconds to the page load, just based on the round trip to get to fetch those files. So HTTP2 is better because it allows the browser to request all the files in one huge fell swoop. And then what will happen is the server, or in this case the CDN, will pump those files out to the client as quickly as possible, as much as the bandwidth will tolerate.
So I jump back over to HTTP as a way of like hacking around HTTP2, basically.
Well, HTTP2 technically supports HTTP without HTTPS. Almost every browser, Chrome included, only support HTTP2 over HTTPS. It's part of how they provide a carrot for using it.
Okay, so as I jump back over to HTTP, this waterfall kind of stretches out a little bit more compared to what David was just saying with HTTP2. If I'm on HTTPS, I should get the benefit of HTTP2, and the waterfall isn't so stretched out. All these files are getting downloaded basically at the same time, rather than, as David was saying, having to wait for one to complete before you can get the next one.
It will, but it won't wait on the browser to acknowledge completion of a file before pumping the next one down. So it doesn't wait on a round trip, and a lot of these files are, well, in both cases for HTTP and HTTP2 on this setup, they're all coming from a CDN. So the round trip that it's doing is the closest one. In the case of yours, if you go back up to the main page, or actually any of these resources, we can see on one of the headers where it's connecting to download the asset. Really any file will do it that comes from Pantheon. If you do, it's X served by, there you go. So this is coming just out of Chicago, which is the closest one to Steve.
Cool.
But like that said, HTTP2 mitigates this issue a lot, but it's not actually as good as doing what we should do in Drupal.
Yeah, so one of the first things that I think about, David, and I think a lot of people think about, is that checkbox that we saw before, this aggregate CSS checkbox, where you turn these on, and now instead of 100 files, we're going to get a lot fewer files, right?
Drupal will combine these into a handful of files. I believe it combines down to about 3. Yeah.
Yeah. So that seems better. But there is something that I think people should do before checking these checkboxes. I'm going to check these off again. It is Halloween, and I'll say one of the scariest parts about building websites for me years ago was editing CSS files that I did not write. David, did you ever have that fear where someone else made a website and maybe you got pulled onto the project later and someone said, hey, David, can you edit this CSS file? Was that ever a scary moment for you?
I can't say I've done a ton of front-end work, but it can be nice to have them off in terms of getting transparency into where things are coming from, because if you use the aggregation, it means that your browser is pretty ignorant of where an actual style is originating from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I have here, I've got this spooky theme, and the three CSS files that are coming from my spooky theme are style.css, that's handling these colors. I've got spooky.css, and I have CSS that should only be used on the artwork content type, not globally.css. Those seem like files that I should be concerned about. So spooky.css, this is a file that I think reflects that fear that I had in much of my web development career, where someone says, hey, edit the CSS, I open up a file, it's gigantic, I don't know what to do, I don't want to break it, so I just add on to the end of it. There are plenty of times where I was literally afraid to edit CSS. So I don't think we have time right now to talk about visual regression tests, but that's something we've talked about it in other webinars, and the basic idea is if you have CSS that you think might not even be used anymore, you should be able to delete it without being afraid of breaking the site. And if you can do visual regression tests, you should be able to delete a whole bunch of CSS and know that you didn't break anything. Similarly, if you have CSS that's really just specific to the artwork teaser image, that should only be loaded when the artwork teaser actually gets loaded. So one of the handy ways to do that in Drupal 8 is by attaching CSS libraries via twig files rather than loading them globally in your theme. So right now my theme is loading spooky.css globally, as well as loading it just when the artwork teaser gets loaded. And really here I should only be loading it when it's needed, not loading it globally. I'll send that up to the site as well. Yeah, the way I like to think about it is before optimizing something, like this is an optimization of CSS, you should have a good grasp of, do we need to be loading this stuff at all? Before we optimize, let's ask, is this needed at all? And there's probably a lot more that we could strip out. Like I doubt all 100 of those CSS files are actually getting used here. All right, David, what else is wrong with this site?
Well, I also wanted to mention that one of the other advantages of aggregating it is in the efficiency of the compression. That there are some technologies coming down the pipeline. I think it's called brutally compression. That isn't that broadly available or implemented yet, but it allows compression to be applied to multiple requests simultaneously from a server. But until that's available, most compression on these servers is just going to use things like gzip, which can only compress a single response at a time. And the way that compression works is by identifying repeated text patterns and then swapping them out with tokens, so that there's this thing called a dictionary that allows the file to get compressed, and the more that you combine together to do the compression, the more efficient it is. So you'll actually notice that the weight in terms of the number of kilobytes of CSS is actually way lower after aggregation than it is when they're all splayed out.
Interesting.
So that's another thing that HTTP2 can't fix on its own until a couple more technologies come down the pipe. So there are several advantages here, but
So you said our total size of CSS got smaller, but this page is still pretty huge.
Yes. If we go back to the, do you want to run a lighthouse test on it to show the worst offenders?
Well,
we can look for here. Yeah, here's.
Yeah, we're low on time.
Yeah. Okay.
But I've got some gigantic images here. Probably don't need to be rendering this giant image. That is a large spider right there. Thank you, Met.
I actually think spiders should be as large as possible, but.
But maybe we should be using an image style rather than rendering the giant original size image. I'm going to go over to my content types here, and I'm going to say for the teaser display of artwork, let's see, I want the image, not the original size. Even just the large size will be a big improvement. And Atusa, watching the clock again here. Do we have a lot of questions coming in?
We do have some that we should try and get to. I would say give yourself another couple minutes, and we can do at least 10 minutes of Q&A.
All right.
If we can get a few of the images down in size, then we can run the speed test once more.
All right.
You may need to flush the page cache as well. Because the page cache will continue referring to those things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we're going to have time to get into it today, but we offer a module called Advanced Page Cache.
Mm-hmm.
That allows us the content management system to tag the content that's outgoing, and it allows keeping things like pages a long time in the CDN, but still selectively invalidating them granularly as the content changes. But these changes are definitely more important for most sites, getting the page weight to be lighter.
All right, I see what I did wrong, David.
Okay.
I adjusted the image style on the default view mode of the artwork content type, but not the teaser.
For the view? Okay.
Teaser. There we go.
Yep.
Now images are only 239 kilobytes rather than 16 megabytes. David, you said you want me to run an audit. Should I just use the default?
Let's use the test my site tool.
Oh yeah.
It's just test my site.thinkwithgoogle.com. So I just ran it and it's looking pretty great now.
Great.
But one of the nice things that this test rules out is your local connection. It's reliably using a 3G style connection, but no faster and no slower.
Mm-hmm. That's nice. Yeah, as I've run like the tool that's built into Chrome a couple times, I found like the score for the same site will vary wildly up and down. And I presume that's just because of my local internet connection speed.
It can be.
Better.
So we shaved a few seconds off, and now the page load on mobile is fast enough that Google doesn't even have any percentage that it really knows that it expects us to lose visitors on.
Great.
Yep.
All right, Atusa, let's take some questions, and it's possible we'll have time for a quick Pantheon Advanced Page Cache demo, but let's make sure we get questions answered.
All right. First one is, hello. What CDNs do you recommend to use for better performance?
So on the platform, we have a partnership with Fastly to deliver a global CDN, and we think Fastly is a great one. It's the same CDN that's powering things like NFL.com and the New York Times, and we integrate that as a bundled part of every site on Pantheon. That includes for the delivery of the page cache and HTTPS. There are a lot of good CDNs out there, though. If you're budget constrained, Cloudflare is often a great first choice because you can implement their basic stuff at no cost, and their full service term in terms of business plan level hits about a couple $100 a month. And the same is true for Fastly. If you start using Fastly for a site and put HTTPS on it, you can also do that for about a couple $100 a month to get all of that. If you're going super corporate with it, there's of course kind of the always the elephant in the room of Akamai. They're not my first choice for Drupal because they can be complicated to configure for Drupal sites compared to, say, Cloudflare and Fastly, but they certainly have an amazing network of POPs. There are security-focused CDNs like Encapsula, and there are cloud-integrated CDNs like CloudFront on AWS and the integrated CDN and load balancing layer on Google Cloud. But that said, if you use Pantheon for the site, you really don't need a CDN. In addition, at least you don't need one in addition to the one that we have. It's already the same infrastructure that's running things like the New York Times, even for a basic site on the platform.
Our next one is, there must be a better way to deal with browser caching or CDN caching external scripts in WordPress. What can you suggest?
So external scripts, if they're loaded off another server, that gets a little complicated now in terms of what's the best option. Because with HTTP 2, the browser can request as many things as it wants from one server. So there's not the same advantage that there used to be of putting things on different domains. It's actually a penalty to put things on multiple domains because it has to establish multiple connections, and there's not really any upside to that anymore. So the only real reason to use external hosting for these things, where you use, say, Google's copy of something like jQuery or fonts or other resources, is so that the browser already has them cached. But that's actually a pretty good reason to use them. I don't know about what is a better way to deal with these things. Often there are modules or plugins that allow you to use externally cached copies of things. Steve might have some more color to provide in this answer.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves when it comes to performance is social share buttons. So what we have here is ridiculously responsive social sharing buttons. So this is, I think, one of the good ones in that it's designed to use basically server-side rendering of the links. Often when sites want this kind of functionality of social share buttons, you'll use JavaScript coming from maybe Twitter directly or Facebook directly, or some third-party aggregator that will give you one JavaScript file that will render all of these. In my opinion, what these buttons do fundamentally is they're icons that are wrapped with links that go to specially formed URLs for sharing on Facebook and Twitter. And you don't need JavaScript at all for that. Sometimes these buttons will slow down a site by an entire second or more because they're loading so much JavaScript and additional assets, when, in my opinion, they don't need any JavaScript whatsoever. They don't need anything external whatsoever. I think it's worth asking, how important are these buttons, and are they worth the performance penalty of external scripts? I think for most sites, they are not worth the performance penalty of anything external. You can get the job done just with CSS and regular old HTML links.
All right. Next question is, when I check aggregate CSS and JS, my site breaks. How do you recommend starting to troubleshoot that?
Well, yeah, my first thought is, well, is the JavaScript breaking or is the CSS breaking? Either is possible. If the CSS is breaking, I think what I'd be looking at is, well, are specific elements changing in their style? In which case I would then use the inspect side of things, where I can look at an element, I can see what styles are getting applied to an element. In this case, the styles are coming from these aggregated files. But if the breakage were just in the CSS, you could have one version of the site with aggregation on, one version of the site with aggregation off, and Pantheon plug. Multi-dev is a great way to do that kind of thing. We've been looking at a multi-dev here, PR4. I've got another one loaded up here, PR6. So you can have different multi-devs that have them on and off and compare them against one another. So if it's CSS, I would just look at what styles are actually getting applied, and hope that would give me a hint of what styles are either loading in a different order because of aggregation, or perhaps not loading at all because of aggregation. If it's JavaScript that's causing the breakage, well then I would want to know what file being aggregated causes the breakage. And the first thing that comes to mind for troubleshooting that is basically one by one force excluding files from aggregation. And I think that can be done in a couple of different ways. But basically, let's see, API, wait. Yes, this must have been a Drupal question, because WordPress doesn't have this concept in core. Is hook.js alter still there? It is. This is a dangerous hook, but for our purpose here, it might do you some good. So what you can do is implement this hook in a custom module, and really what this is going to do is it'll give you access to a big PHP array that has within it all of your JavaScript files. So again, working on the assumption that aggregating JavaScript causes something to break, that makes me think it's one or two files specifically getting added to the aggregation that's causing the breakage. One by one, force exclude those files from being aggregated by messing with this variable. And then that's kind of a brute force way of finding what is the breaking file, but that should get the job done.
All right. Next question is, do you provide a method for individually clearing specific items from the Fastly cache, like one image, etc.?
We do. One of the things that automatically uses this is the advanced page cache module, which we also make available as a plugin for WordPress. So what this does is it takes advantage of a feature that is almost exclusive to some of the most advanced CDNs, which includes Fastly, Akamai, and Cloudflare Enterprise. They all have a feature that is equivalent to this, but we bundle it as part of the Fastly partnership on Pantheon. And it uses a semi-standard header called surrogate key, which lists all of the different ingredients going onto the page. And so by listing all the ingredients going onto the page or path or URL, whatever has that content, can get flushed out of the CDN if the content that was an ingredient changed. So in this case, this thing has node 10, 11, and 12, and 13, and 16, and 17, and 18 on it. If any one of those nodes change, then this page will get flushed out of the CDN and replaced.
let's do a real quick demo. Let's do the super fast demo of Pantheon Advanced Page Cache. So David just said if what was it, node 10 gets changed, that page will get flushed from cache. So I'm loading up node 10 here in the edit screen. It's a butterfly. So what we're looking at is the age header here. Right now it's been sitting in the cache for 55 seconds. If I save node 10 here, it should be purged from the cache. So I'm curling just the home page of this pull request 6 environment, and my age has dropped back down to 0 because node 10 here got saved. And as I request it again, the cache starts going up.
All right. I'm going to try and sneak one or two more questions in here. You mentioned that you can improve your Test My Site with Google Score if you're running WordPress or Drupal. Can you elaborate on this?
You can improve your score. What I mean is there are some parts of your score that can be improved by reconfiguring Drupal or WordPress, and there are some parts of your score that you can only improve by putting your site on faster infrastructure, like a reverse proxy cache or CDN. So just to, while Steve is setting up his demo, we're actually kind of out of time, but there are some sites that I have. If we have time to run through another test, we could show. I don't know if we can go over, but we could show running the test on a site that doesn't have a CDN and how, even at the bottom, the suggestions by Google will not shave off that much of the load time.
We might just have time for
some other questions. In any case, what you want to do is when you run the Test My Site with Google, then just note the difference between the two numbers, because they're going to have a total page load time and they're going to have how much you can save by fixing things on the site. And if there's a big difference between the numbers, then the problem could very well be your hosting provider or lack of CDN, because the suggestions at the bottom Google's suggestions are primarily for reconfiguring something like Drupal or WordPress, not for changing your infrastructure.
All right, Steve, do you think one more question is acceptable?
Sure.
All right. Let's sneak one in here. Let's see. Can you utilize multiple CDNs? Fastly is awesome except in China. China Cache is a better option in mainland China. I'd like to use both. Is that possible?
You can stack them. We do provide the ability to stack a CDN on top of something like Pantheon, even though we integrate with Fastly. For people not unfamiliar with it, part of the reason behind this question is that Fastly does not have any POPs in mainland China. So what that means is that anyone accessing the site from China has to route through the Great Firewall. It means that they often can't use HTTPS because that often is blocked across the firewall. So in general, if you really want to deliver to a mainland China audience, then you want a CDN with a presence there. China Cache is one of them. The ones that I primarily have worked with are Cloudflare and Akamai, both of which have partnerships with companies within mainland China to proxy the content and get sites approved. It has to be done on a per-site basis because approving a site to be deployed that way requires paperwork with the Chinese government. And you basically have to accept content restrictions on the site and other rules for operating it in order to do that, and not just a CDN, which is part of why we don't do that, because our acceptable use policy on Pantheon allows things that would not be allowed if you wanted your site to have presence in mainland China officially.
Okay, I'm going to sneak one more in because somebody said that it's a very important question, and that is, how do you guys handle critical CSS?
Critical CSS. So we don't have any implicit system for determining what is critical versus not. It's a concern of the CMS. We do deliver the data to the browser as the CMS is sending the data, in the sense that if the CMS knows what its critical CSS is and sends it first, that will help. One thing you can do to accelerate critical CSS is you can take advantage of HTTP push, where on the platform you can send headers that have a hint to preload. There we go. In this case, Steve has added something like that, and with HTTPS and HTTP2 and the preloading stuff and aggregation, it's often almost as good just to send all of them as preload. But what this does is, by sending that hint down, as soon as the browser starts loading that page from the CDN, it will actually start pushing down the CSS that it expects it to need before the browser even asks for it. So before the browser even has the response collected, before it's even parsed the page, it'll start receiving the critical CSS. This is mostly useful for mobile devices. We have higher latency connections, including over the mobile hop itself.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more color there, I agree with David that knowing what is the critical CSS and delivering it is mainly the responsibility of the CMS and the developers. So on the Drupal side of things, this HTTP2 server push module is the module that I installed in order to get these headers added. It's a great module in that it requires zero configuration. This is a direction a lot of Drupal modules have been going lately, largely thanks to the advocacy of Wim Leers. A module like this, you just turn it on and it works. There's a WordPress plugin that does HTTP2 server push in a similar fashion. The question of knowing what is the critical CSS, I follow a Twitter account that just announces new modules as they're added. So in the last week or two here, I saw critical CSS module got added. I'm pretty sure the broader module, advanced aggregation, which does lots of performance things, also can handle critical CSS. But if you're looking for just critical CSS in a low complexity fashion, this module seems like a decent option.
Alrighty, on that note, that is definitely all the time we have for today. Thank you all so much for joining us this creepy Halloween. If you have any questions or feedback, please visit our website where you'll find a contact us page and we'll put you in touch with the best member of our team. And make sure you join us for the next edition of Couch Coding. Have a great week, everyone.